There's a serene hidden lake just a short walk from my house in Parsonfield, Maine. I've been fishing there for as long as I've lived here. It's tucked away from any roads or houses, offering perfect seclusion. I was always the only one out on the lake, fishing in peace. In fact, I'd leave my kayak in the same spot by the lake whenever I wasn't using it. It was easier than hauling it back and forth to my house every time I wanted to go out. I'd lean it against this massive tree. The kayak was heavy enough that it wouldn't topple over from a storm or wind, and I also covered it to prevent critters from getting inside. One warm summer evening, I had been on the lake for about an hour, catching a few trout that I tossed into my cooler. By now, dusk had fallen, and the little light left in the sky was fading behind the trees. I was getting ready to pack it in for the night when I heard noises from the lake's edge. I looked over and saw someone standing by the water, tipping a barrel of some kind and pouring its contents into the lake. From my view, it looked like they were polluting the water with something. I couldn't help myself and called out, "Hey, what are you doing?" The person looked up at me, then bolted into the woods, the barrel still spilling whatever was inside into the lake. I squinted, trying to see what had been poured into the water. It appeared to be a dark red liquid. Though with the light fading, I couldn't be completely sure, but it was definitely something dark. A sense of unease crept over me, and I decided it was time to leave. As someone who loves nature, the sight of someone polluting like that made me sick, and I couldn't resist shouting at the person, but I didn't feel comfortable sticking around any longer. I planned to report this to the Department of Environmental Protection. I paddled back to my usual spot, pulled my kayak ashore, and started unloading my gear. As I was covering the kayak, I heard a single snap from nearby, like the sound of a footstep on a branch. I stopped for a second, debating whether to call out, "Who's there?" But I decided against it. Instead, I hurriedly finished covering the kayak, leaving it lying flat on the ground instead of propping it up against the tree like I usually did. I grabbed my gear and cooler, then quickly headed back to the road that led to my house. It was only a short walk, but I kept glancing over my shoulder the whole way, convinced someone was following me. As soon as I got home, I stashed my gear in the shed and rushed inside, locking the door behind me as fast as I could. My heart was still pounding, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I rinsed off the trout and stored them in the fridge, deciding I'd cook them the next day. That night, I just heated up some leftovers. As the microwave beeped to signal the food was done, there was a knock at my front door. That same wave of dread I felt on my walk home surged back through me, and my suspicion that I'd been followed was confirmed. Who else would be knocking this late at night? My lights were on, and my car was in the driveway. Whoever it was knew I was home. I had all the blinds closed so they couldn't see in. Another knock. The microwave beeped again, louder this time. Whoever was outside must have heard it through the cracked windows. Then I heard a knock at one of the windows, followed by a man's voice. "Hey, I think you saw me at the lake earlier. I just want to explain." There was no way I was opening the door for this guy. The fact that he followed me home said enough. He knocked again, harder this time, and kept yelling, "Hello," through the window. At that point, I decided to respond. "Leave, or I'm calling the police," I yelled. He responded calmly, almost too calmly. "Sir, just open the door. I'll explain everything." I repeated my threat, but after that, I didn't hear his voice again. I immediately went around and locked every window in the house, turned on the air conditioner, and made a report to the non-emergency police number, detailing what happened both at the lake and at my house. I also filed an online report with the Department of Environmental Protection about the incident at the lake. Honestly, making those reports made me feel a bit better as I tried to sleep that night. I'm a light sleeper though, and sure enough, around 2 a.m., I heard a crash from downstairs. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my Glock from the closet, and listened. I could hear quiet, deliberate footsteps on the creaky wooden stairs. I held my breath, gun loaded, and aimed at the bedroom door as I stood behind the dresser. The steps grew louder, and then I heard the doorknob slowly turn. The door opened, and I saw a silhouette step into the room. Without hesitation, I flipped on the lamp beside me, revealing the gun in my hands. "Get on the ground," I screamed. The man raised his hands as if signaling for me to calm down, but I noticed he had a small blade. I told him to drop it, but he just said, "I'm leaving," and turned to run. I yelled for him to stop, but he took his chance, knowing I wasn't going to shoot. I heard him dash down the stairs and out the front door. I locked the door as soon as he was gone and called 911. The living room window had been shattered, glass littering the floor. I stayed on alert until the police arrived, not taking my eyes off the broken window. When they finally came, I had to explain the whole story again. The officers agreed to go with me to the lake to look for the barrel, but after 20 minutes of searching, we found nothing. The man must have taken it with him. I gave the best description I could. A short, bearded, white guy with a receding hairline and glasses, wearing a black flannel and black pants. The police left, and I spent the rest of the night wide awake in the living room with my gun by my side. At dawn, my brothers came over to help fix the window. One of them, Dale, stayed with me for a few nights until things calmed down. My theory is that the barrel contained human remains, possibly dissolved in some kind of acid. Why else would that guy follow me home and break into my house? Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And I knew if I had opened the door for him that night, something terrible might have happened. Ever since I was a kid, the older men in my family would take me fishing whenever they got the chance. It felt like a family tradition. Being the youngest meant I was next in line to become an expert, just like all of them claimed to be. My dad and his brother Matthew were the most serious about it. Our house, and my uncle's, looked like the kind you see on fishing shows. Completely decked out. I won't go into too much detail, but stepping into our home, it was obvious my parents spent more time on the water than on land. This story, though, isn't mine. It's my dad's. My dad, John, is a pretty tough guy to scare, but when he tells this story, it's like he becomes a different person. He doesn't like talking about it, but every now and then, at a family gathering or special occasion, someone will ask him to share it, and he will. One time, he and my Uncle Matthew, along with their close friends Rich, Jeff, and Monty, went out fishing. They set out before the sun was even up, heading to a remote spot they all agreed was a prime fishing location. It was a couple of hours boat ride from the nearest marina, tucked away in a secluded cove that few people explored. The spot was known for its plentiful bass and the occasional pike. The day started out like any other fishing trip. Everyone in high spirits as the boat cut through the mist rising off the water, sharing jokes and stories over the hum of the engine. They anchored in a familiar cove, surrounded by dense forest. Monty was the first to crack open a beer, even though it was early morning. My dad always says, Monty is the wild one, the guy who drinks a little more than he should. For hours, they fished peacefully, with the occasional splash of an oar hitting the water or the sound of their laughter breaking the quiet. And of course, the crunch of empty beer cans. As the day went on, they caught their fair share of fish, and each catch was met with small celebrations. But as dusk approached, the light started to fade, and a thick fog rolled in from the water. My dad described it as if the boat was being swallowed by the fog. Rich, the most experienced fisherman in the group, kept saying he had never seen fog like this. Jeff, the joker of the group, and Monty, who was almost as drunk as Jeff, didn't seem too bothered. It was getting darker, and they figured they could just wait out the fog, but it wasn't going anywhere. My dad and Rich agreed that Matthew should try to drive the boat out of the cove and into the open ocean, where the fog might not be as thick. Matthew, although typically cautious, almost crashed into the shore in the process. Not wanting to risk damaging his beloved boat, he decided to stay put. They reluctantly accepted that they might have to spend the night on the boat. My dad mentioned that they should contact their families to let them know what was happening. But of course, they had drifted into an area where there was no signal. My dad had some work issued attention, so ignoring the problem wasn't an option. He offered to go ashore to find a signal, and Rich and Jeff decided to go with him. Matthew stayed behind with an increasingly inebriated Monty to watch the boat. My dad, Rich, and Jeff jumped out of the boat, only getting a bit wet, and made their way to shore. My dad grabbed the emergency flares from the boat just in case they got lost and needed to signal Matthew to come get them. The three of them started hiking into the pitch-black forest, using only their phone flashlights for light. They'd all spent plenty of time camping, so the forest didn't scare them too much at first. They headed uphill, thinking that higher ground might give them a better chance of getting a signal. My dad always stresses how eerie the forest felt. The darkness combined with the heavy fog was like nothing they'd ever experienced. Then they started hearing these strange clicking noises. At first, they thought it was coming from directly in front of them, but soon the sounds seemed to surround them. These weren't typical forest sounds. The clicking was rhythmic yet unpredictable, almost like someone was tapping out a secret code. One thing became clear. Whatever was making the noise, it wasn't natural. Rich, being the survivalist of the group, urgently whispered for them to turn off their flashlights. "Don't give away our position," he said, his voice tight with concern. As the lights went out, the darkness seemed even thicker, pressing in on them. The clicking stopped, leaving behind a silence that was somehow worse. Time seemed to stretch as they stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. They all shared the same terrifying thought. They might have stumbled upon some kind of secret group or strange cult in the woods. Just when the silence became unbearable, there was rustling, much closer this time. Then, out of nowhere, a guttural scream ripped through the night. It was a sound so primal and full of anguish that it sent chills down their spines. Before they could react, they heard rapid footsteps charging toward them. Acting on instinct, my dad shot off a flare behind them. For a moment, the flare lit up the forest, and they saw something that made their blood run cold. A group of more than 10 figures, dressed in what looked like tribal attire, some holding wooden spears. The flare's light quickly faded, plunging them back into darkness. Jeff screamed and nearly tripped, but Rich grabbed him and kept him moving. My dad describes this part as the most intense fear he has ever felt. They were dodging branches and jumping over roots, desperate to get back to the boat. By some miracle, they made it out of the forest and back to the boat, breathless and disoriented but alive. They screamed at Matthew to start the engine, and he didn't ask any questions. He fired up the boat immediately. Just as the boat lurched forward, my dad fired another flare into the air, back toward the shore. In the brief light of the flare, they saw them, at least 15 figures, standing silently at the water's edge. As soon as they got far enough away, Matthew cut the engine, and the only sound was their heavy breathing. My dad says he didn't fully process what had happened for nearly an hour. He was running on pure adrenaline. They took turns keeping watch throughout the night and left as soon as the fog lifted in the morning. Ironically, Monty had passed out before any of this went down and didn't remember a single thing. Even now, when my dad tells this story, I get chills, and I can only imagine what he must feel when he thinks back on that night. I've been fishing for as long as I can remember, and now that I'm almost 60 years old, I still can't think of a better way to spend my time. Even though I've been out on the water thousands of times, fishing never gets old for me. My kids are grown and have moved on with their own lives, leaving the house quiet, sometimes so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Every now and then, I miss the good old days, tossing the pigskin around with my boys in the backyard, but some things just aren't part of the plan anymore. These days, I usually fish with a few buddies from my college days, but more often than not, I find myself heading out alone, like a lone wolf. This was one of those times. I hadn't stepped foot outside upstate New York in over 15 years. I mean, why would I? We've got some of the best fishing lakes in the country, and I intend to make full use of them. It was mid-April, early in the season, just after the ice had melted and before May rolled in. For some reason, I wanted a more secluded spot this time, so I picked an unremarkable little lake in the middle of nowhere. It was small and out of the way. I hit the road about an hour before sunrise, determined to be on the water just as the sun made its appearance. I unstrapped my kayak from the car roof and carried it over to the lake. I paddled out to the center and soaked in the gorgeous early morning colors as they began to paint the sky. It felt like home. You could bet your bottom dollar I wouldn't trade a day like this for anything. The air was a bit chilly, but I've got tough skin, nothing I couldn't handle. As the sun was about to peek over the horizon, I started gearing up. I was aiming for largemouth bass, so I moved back toward the weed beds on the edge of the lake, planning to venture back to the center if the fishing was slow. I set up my 6.5-foot medium-action spinning rod with a 9-pound monofilament line and used my trusted wacky rig, a 4-inch rubber stick worm. It's always been my go-to for largemouths. Just as I was about to cast out, something strange caught my eye across the lake. At first, I thought it was another fisherman, but something about the scene was off. Curiosity got the best of me, and I reached into my bag for my binoculars, something I usually use for birdwatching. When I zoomed in, I saw 3 figures, dressed in dark clothes with their faces hidden under hoods. They were digging a hole near the edge of the lake. I kept watching, expecting them to bury something, but they did the opposite. One of them pulled something out of the hole, though I couldn't make out exactly what it was. The others followed suit, each pulling out more items. I was stumped. Then, to my surprise, they began tossing the objects into the lake, each one making a distinct splash as it hit the water. Something felt terribly wrong. A wave of unease washed over me, and I started thinking maybe these folks were dangerous. I didn't know what to do, but luckily they left without noticing me. I thought about just minding my own business and letting it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Once they had disappeared into the woods, I slowly paddled over to the spot. My hands were shaking as I approached. I wasn't fishing for bass anymore. I was fishing for something else entirely. I spent about an hour poking around in the water with no success. Frustrated, I racked my brain for ideas. Then it hit me. I had my depth finder in the car. Determined to figure out what was going on, I paddled back to shore, grabbed the depth finder from my Volvo, and made my way back to the area. I started scanning the lake bed, but all I was feeling was soft, mushy ground, until I hit something solid. Something metal. I mentally marked the spot and swapped out my wacky rig for the biggest hook I had. Slowly, I let out my line, feeling every slight movement. 50 years of fishing experience was going into this one catch. After a minute, the line tugged with more resistance than usual. I had snagged something. I reeled it in carefully, making sure not to lose it. When I finally pulled it up, I could hardly believe my eyes. A black 9mm handgun dangled from the end of my line. My heart was racing. I didn't feel safe anymore. I reeled the gun into the kayak without touching it and paddled to shore as fast as I could. As soon as I hit dry land, I called the police. They launched a full investigation and recovered a few more unsettling items from the lake. I stayed to watch them search because I needed to know what else was down there. Among the things they found were a keychain with several keys and a bundle of old foreign coins wrapped in cloth. But the creepiest thing they uncovered was a locket. It was waterlogged, and the pictures inside were faded beyond recognition. The police said they'd contact me if they ever linked the items to a crime, but I never got a call. Still, the story didn't end there. A few nights later, I heard someone outside my house saying, "That's the car, I'm sure of it." I heard people moving around in my yard, but they never rang the doorbell or knocked. After a few minutes, they left. I still don't know if those people were connected to what happened at the lake, or if they're watching me. Every time I leave my house now, I can't help but wonder if I'm being followed. I contacted the police again, hoping they'd reopen the investigation, but nothing came of it. To this day, I have so many unanswered questions. Why did they bury those things in the first place? Why dig them up and throw them into the lake? Maybe they realized the items had a better chance of being found on land, so they decided to dump them in the water instead. Or maybe those things had been hidden for years, and they finally decided to get rid of them for good. All in all, this was the strangest thing that's ever happened to me while fishing. Throughout my life, I would go through phases of different hobbies. I'd pick up something that intrigued me, become obsessed with it for about a year or so, and then move on to something else to keep myself entertained. In the summer of 2022, my hobby of choice was fishing. About an hour's drive away from my home is a shore house my family has owned for decades. It's right on the water, with a lagoon and a small Boston whaler. My friends and I would frequently take trips there to fish and hang out. It was the following October, after summer had ended, when my two friends, Kevin and Arion, suggested we hit the shore house for the weekend to try our luck at catching some striper, as they're abundant during the fall months. Kevin was an avid fisherman, and his enthusiasm was what got me into the whole fishing thing in the first place. Unfortunately, our boat was out of the water for maintenance at the time, so we had to stick to fishing off the beach and piers. This wasn't an issue, though, since Kevin had all the necessary rods and gear for that. We got together on a Friday afternoon, and I drove us down. Once we arrived, we spent the day fishing off different piers along the inlet. As night fell, only one of us had managed to catch anything. Kevin, of course. It was just a small bass, nothing to write home about. Frustrated with our lack of luck, we decided to stay up late and try fishing off the beach during the night. Kevin mentioned he knew a good spot about 15 minutes away, which led us down a deserted road lined with trees on both sides. The road eventually opened up into what seemed like a small gravel parking area. Kevin suggested we grab everything we needed from the car, as we didn't want to make trips back and forth. We planned on staying up until sunrise, so we packed accordingly. We walked for about 5 minutes down a path that led to a massive empty beach. We set up camp, which consisted of beach chairs, a speaker, and 2 coolers, one filled with ice for fish, and the other packed with snacks, water, and beers. Kevin brought these huge fishing rods, perfect for beach fishing, along with rod holders that could be hammered into the sand. He even had these small bells that attached to the tip of the rods to alert us to any movement. We all cast our lines, cracked open a few beers, and settled in to wait. Within a couple of hours, each of us had caught a decent-sized fish, which lifted our spirits. We were having a great time, music blaring, knowing that no one else was around on this secluded beach. In the middle of a conversation, Arion suddenly stopped talking, lowered the music, and whipped his head to the left. He asked if we had heard something. Kevin and I exchanged confused glances and said no. Arion, still focused, said he thought he heard someone yell, something like "hey" or "yo." We brushed it off, thinking he was either hearing things or trying to mess with us, but he swore he heard something. It seemed unlikely, given that we were on a hidden beach at 1 a.m., so we soon forgot about it and resumed our conversation. A few minutes later, just after I cast out a fresh hook, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There was something moving on the beach, but I couldn't quite make out what it was. The others saw it too. As it got closer, we realized it was a person walking toward us. We went silent and turned off the music. A middle-aged man, probably in his 40s or 50s, wearing a dark blue jacket with the hood up, approached us. The way he walked up to us was unsettling, and he had a strange, intimidating look on his face. We awkwardly greeted him with a, "What's up?" He stood there, eyeing us for what felt like 10 long seconds, before finally saying in a low voice, "What are you boys up to?" It was obvious what we were doing, but Kevin answered, "We're fishing." The man let out a grunt, nodding his head. He didn't say anything else, just stood there, staring at us, the rods, and then out at the water. We exchanged uneasy glances, worried he might be planning to rob us, but we figured he couldn't take all 3 of us. Just then, one of the bells on our rods jingled, breaking the tension. I said, "We got one," more to break the silence than anything else. I walked over to reel in a small striper. By the time I turned around, the man had started walking away, his dark silhouette fading into the night. We sat there, talking about how odd the encounter had been. He hadn't harmed us, so we figured he was just some weird guy passing through. Even so, we kept the music off for the rest of the night, just to be cautious, and continued fishing. At some point while gazing out at the horizon, I heard something in the distance. It took a second to register, but when it did, my heart sank. It was a car alarm. I knew immediately it was mine. Ours was the only car in the lot, and there weren't any houses nearby for miles. Panic set in, and we sprinted back to the car, leaving our gear behind. It took us a couple of minutes to get there, and when we arrived, I was horrified. My tires had been slashed, and the driver's side window was shattered. I called the police right away and explained the situation. The dispatcher asked if I had any idea who might have done it, and I mentioned the strange man we had encountered earlier. Just as I said this, we heard rustling in the woods surrounding us. My heart raced, and I felt trapped. Without thinking, we ran about 200 yards down the road and hid in the trees. I whispered to the dispatcher what we were doing, and she told us to stay hidden and quiet. Within 10 minutes, 2 police cars arrived with their lights on. We ran back to the lot, where 3 officers were already searching the area. A number of things had been stolen, including my wallet, some cash from the glove box, and most of Kevin's fishing gear. They found a large knife on the ground near the car, which they collected as evidence. I told the officers the whole story, still shaking with adrenaline. They reassured us that running away and hiding was the right move, as the man likely intended to harm us. Hearing that made me appreciate how lucky we were. The officers helped us gather our remaining equipment and escorted us back to the shore house. We stayed up the rest of the night, reflecting on the terrifying ordeal we'd just gone through. The next morning, Ariane arranged for us to get a ride back up north. I got my car from the shop a few days later, but the experience stuck with me. To this day, it remains the most frightening thing I've ever been through. What was supposed to be a fun, laid-back fishing trip turned into a nightmare that cost me hundreds of dollars in damages. I never heard anything from the police afterward, meaning that man is still out there somewhere. Needless to say, I gave up fishing as a hobby after that and haven't touched a rod since.